The Auction of Chains. Gabriel Stroud, a battle-worn soldier with scars both visible and hidden, wandered through the vast, crowded spaceport of Far Station. His heart sought the quiet of a distant corner of the galaxy, where he could finally leave behind the brutal echoes of war. Yet, as he meandered through the chaotic marketplace, he realized that peace was harder to find than he thought. The air around him was thick with the clamor of countless languages and the sharp scent of spices, metals, and the stale aroma of crowded bodies. For all its wonder, the station felt like an endless tide of noise and confusion, a far cry from the calm he craved. Stroud moved through the market, scanning the stalls more out of habit than interest. His path took an unexpected turn when he heard a voice blaring above the commotion, amplified by a loudspeaker, each word harsh and commanding. He turned, frowning, as he took in the sight of a makeshift stage, where an auctioneer, a rotund alien with a dozen glittering eyes, was proudly presenting his merchandise to a crowd. Stroud's gaze hardened as he watched a procession of captives led onto the stage, each in shackles, their postures broken but not beaten. Alien species from all corners of the galaxy stood on that platform, their fear palpable even at a distance. Among them, a group of 4 alien women caught his attention. They were different from the rest. Despite their chains, a spark of resilience shone in their eyes. The tallest of the 4 stood with a fierce stance, her bronze skin gleaming under the harsh lights. Her eyes locked onto the crowd defiantly, refusing to submit. Beside her was a delicate figure with silvery skin that seemed to ripple and shimmer with every movement. Her eyes, wide and haunting, hinted at a depth of sadness that went beyond fear. The third had a feline elegance, her sharp gaze filled with a mix of suspicion and anger, a readiness to spring at the first chance of escape. And the last, a plant-like being with translucent greenish skin, stood quietly apart, her eyes thoughtful, as though already formulating plans for freedom. Stroud's fists clenched at his sides as he watched, memories of past battles flickering to life in his mind. He had fought to protect others, to bring justice in a galaxy often ruled by those with power, but no compassion. Now he felt the weight of his age, his wariness, and the futility of one man's defiance against a corrupt system. The auctioneer's booming voice snapped him out of his reverie. Bids were rising, fast and fierce, each number like a sharp stab in his chest. He knew he shouldn't interfere. These were powerful people, the kinds who thrived on greed and cruelty. But then his gaze fell on the tallest of the women, her defiant eyes scanning the crowd as though daring someone to buy her, only to try and control her. Gabriel felt his heart twist. His late wife, Alana, would have never let him walk away from such a sight. She had always believed that one act of kindness could ripple across worlds, and he could almost hear her voice whispering to him, urging him not to abandon them. Before he knew it, he was stepping forward, his voice rough with determination. 5,000 credits, he shouted, his voice cutting through the crowd. The auctioneer paused, all 12 eyes swiveling to him with a glint of interest. Other bidders turned as well, eyeing him with surprise and amusement. Stroud, the lone human in a sea of alien faces, stood his ground, his expression unyielding. 5,000 credits from the human, the auctioneer echoed, a smirk creeping onto his face. Do I hear 6? The bidding continued, climbing higher and higher, each call bringing a fresh wave of doubt. Stroud was digging deep into his savings, his hands growing clammy with each raised bid, but he couldn't stop. The fierce determination in the alien woman's eyes held him captive, and he knew he had to see it through. At 15,000 credits, a voice as smooth as silk joined the fray. Stroud turned, narrowing his eyes as he saw a tall, regal figure step forward, adorned in flowing robes that shimmered under the dim lights. Prince Kayla, a notorious warlord who controlled a vast stretch of lawless territory, eyed the stage with predatory intent. His cold, calculating gaze swept over the captives before landing on Stroud with a look of disdain. 20,000 credits, Stroud called, his voice steady but his heart pounding. Kayla hesitated, his eyes narrowing, as though gauging the old soldier's resolve. For a moment, Stroud feared the prince would raise the stakes. But Kayla merely sneered, stepping back with an air of dismissive disdain. The crowd murmured, surprised, as Kayla turned and disappeared into the shadows. Sold, the auctioneer bellowed, his grin widening with greed. To the human, for 20,000 credits. Stroud released a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He stepped toward the stage, his heart hammering as the crowd parted around him, whispers and curious glances following his every step. As he reached the platform, the guards unlocked the captive's shackles. Stroud met each of their gazes, a sullen promise in his eyes. "You're free," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't want anything from you, just freedom." The tallest woman, her defiance tempered with curiosity, regarded him with a skeptical frown. "Why?" she demanded, her voice low and wary. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply, knowing the answer would never fully satisfy their suspicion. He had been hardened by years of combat, but kindness and integrity had always defined his actions. Even as his soul bore the scars of war, his heart had not forgotten compassion. One by one, they stepped down from the platform, their movements tentative. None of them ran. Instead, they looked to Stroud, hesitant yet drawn by a glimmer of trust he had somehow earned in those brief moments. The bronze-skinned warrior, who introduced herself as Ziva, crossed her arms, her fierce gaze unrelenting. "You do realize that freeing us has consequences?" she asked. "Prince Kayla isn't someone who takes kindly to being denied." Stroud shrugged. "I'm an old soldier with a simple life. I don't have much. But what I do have is my word. I promised you sanctuary, and I mean to keep it." Ziva nodded, respect flickering in her eyes. The others introduced themselves cautiously. Nora, the silver-skinned empath, brushed against his mind with a gentle wave of emotion, her curiosity mingling with gratitude. Elith, the feline-like woman, seemed restless, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Finally, Lyra, the quiet, plant-like alien, offered a faint nod, her gentle presence calm and observant. As they boarded his small, weather-beaten ship, Stroud knew he was on the edge of something monumental. This was no simple act of compassion. He had set events in motion that would ripple across the galaxy, drawing him and these four strangers into a journey of survival, trust, and resilience. As the stars streaked past the cockpit window, Stroud couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. These women, each marked by their own battles, were more than just freed captives. In their strength, their resilience, he saw a glimmer of hope, a reminder of the humanity that could shine even in the darkest corners of the universe. Sanctuary amid the stars. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence as they slipped away from Farich Station. Gabriel Stroud's hands moved instinctively over the controls, steadying the vessel as they veered into the calm expanse of space. With each passing second, the clamor and chaos of the spaceport faded behind them, leaving an uneasy stillness in its wake. The four alien women, now free from their chains, sat scattered across the cramped interior, their expressions a mix of wariness and curiosity. They had introduced themselves briefly on the platform, but now, in the quiet of the ship, Stroud could see the weight of their ordeals settling on them like a heavy cloak. Ziva, the tall bronze-skinned warrior, sat nearest to the cockpit, her piercing gaze flickering between Stroud and the various displays, as though assessing every detail of their surroundings. Her fierce demeanor had softened only slightly, but her body language remained taut, like a coiled spring. At her side, Nora, the empath with shimmering silver skin, sat with her eyes closed, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. Stroud could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a calming presence that seemed to radiate from her. Though he was unfamiliar with her abilities, he understood that her telepathy granted her a unique insight into emotions. He wondered if she could feel the maelstrom of uncertainty brewing within him. Elith, The feline-like alien prowled restlessly in the small space, her sharp gaze darting to each corner of the ship. Her distrust was palpable. Even now, she eyed Stroud with suspicion, her claws flexing in and out of sight, as though preparing for a potential fight. And then there was Lyra, the plant-like being with translucent, pale green skin. She sat apart from the others, her delicate limbs folded gracefully, her eyes scanning the ship's inner mechanics with quiet interest. Clearing his throat, Stroud turned to face them, the gravity of his decision finally weighing on him. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me," he began, his voice rough but sincere. "I'm just an old soldier with no grand mission, but I've given you my word. As long as you're with me, you'll have my protection." Ziva's gaze hardened. Protection from what exactly? Do you even realize who you've defied? Her tone was laced with a mixture of anger and concern. Prince Kayla is a warlord. He controls entire sectors with an iron grip. Defying him isn't something that goes unnoticed. Stroud shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "I'm well aware of who he is. I've seen men like him before, men who think they can buy and sell lives as they please. I've fought enough battles to know that some things are worth risking it all for." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Nora shifted, her eyes glimmering with an intensity that seemed to reach beyond her physical form. "You speak of protection, but you're only one man," she said softly, her voice carrying an undertone of empathy. "And we're four individuals marked by our own traumas. This journey won't be as simple as leaving a spaceport." Stroud nodded, understanding the truth in her words. He was just one man, no longer in the prime of his life, facing a world of enemies who would soon be aware of his interference. Yet something in him refused to back down. He had lived through too many injustices to ignore the one right in front of him. After a moment, he set a course for Andara, a quiet, out-of-the-way planet where he had built a small home years ago. "There's a place," he explained, looking to each of them. "It's not much, but it's peaceful, away from the lawless sectors. I can offer you sanctuary there, a chance to figure out your next steps." Ziva crossed her arms, her face guarded. "And what if we don't want to go to this sanctuary? What if we'd rather take our chances elsewhere?" Stroud nodded, respecting her defiance. "You're free to choose, but if you stay with me, you'll have safety, at least for a while." The tension eased slightly, though Elith's eyes never left him. "And what do you get out of this, human?" she demanded, her voice edged with suspicion. "We're not naive enough to believe you risked everything without expecting something in return." Stroud met her gaze steadily. "You're right to be cautious, but I don't expect anything from you. I've lived alone for years, haunted by ghosts of the past. Helping you, it feels like a chance to do something right, something that matters." Nora closed her eyes again, her expression softening as a faint ripple of calm spread through the air, her telepathic influence settling the discord. "He's telling the truth," she murmured, her voice gentle. "There's no deception here, just loneliness." Stroud felt a pang at her words, though he said nothing. He turned his attention back to the ship's console, focusing on the familiar rhythms of space travel as they sped through hyperspace. The stars outside streaked past, each one a distant memory of battles fought and friends lost. And now here he was, heading home with four strangers, their fates intertwined in ways none of them could yet understand. After a long stretch of silence, Zeva moved closer to him. "What kind of life did you leave behind?" she asked, her tone surprisingly soft. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability. Stroud hesitated, his fingers grazing the warm controls of the ship. "I was a soldier, fought in too many battles, saw too much bloodshed. Eventually, I realized I had no one left to fight for." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "My wife, Alana, she believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. She's been gone for years now. I built a home on Andorra, hoping to find peace, but it's been hollow." Nora's gaze softened as she listened, a hint of understanding passing through her eyes. "Perhaps," she said quietly, That emptiness brought you to us. Ziva nodded, her posture relaxing ever so slightly. A soldier without a cause is like a blade without a hand to wield it, she murmured, almost to herself. Maybe we've all been looking for a reason to fight again. The conversation lulled, but a new, unspoken bond had settled among them. Though they were still strangers, the weight of their collective experiences seemed to pull them together, like disparate stars bound to the same gravity. Hours later, the ship broke out of hyperspace, and the serene green and blue sphere of Andorra came into view, bathed in the gentle glow of its twin suns. Stroud guided the ship down through the atmosphere, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar mix of excitement and trepidation. It had been so long since he had shared his home with anyone, and now here he was, bringing 4 strangers into his sanctuary. The ship touched down in a quiet clearing surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the wind, their leaves casting dappled shadows across the landscape. The air was warm, filled with the subtle scent of wildflowers and the distant murmur of a stream. Stroud stepped out first, taking in the familiar surroundings, then gestured for the women to follow. As they disembarked, the silence of the forest seemed to settle over them, a stark contrast to the chaos of Forreach Station. Ziva's wary gaze softened as she took in the tranquil beauty of the land, while Elif prowled along the edge of the clearing, her natural instincts alert but curious. Stroud led them toward his small weathered house, nestled beneath a canopy of ancient trees. "It's simple," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "But it's home." Nora closed her eyes, breathing in the fresh air. "After everything we've been through, this feels like a paradise," she murmured. Elif, though still cautious, allowed herself to relax slightly. "It's quiet," she remarked, as if surprised by the very concept. As they settled in, Stroud could sense their guarded tension easing, their walls lowering by the faintest degrees. Each of them explored the space in their own way, Ziva inspecting the surroundings like a warrior preparing for a battle, Nora taking in the peaceful ambience, Elif remaining close to the edges, and Lyra observing with a keen curiosity, her plant-like appendages brushing lightly over the furniture. As the evening approached, Stroud prepared a modest meal, his movements uncharacteristically awkward as he adjusted to the presence of his unexpected guests. The women gathered around, each bringing their own quiet energy to the table. They ate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, a respite from the storm of uncertainty that had brought them together. And as night fell over the tranquil landscape, Stroud felt a strange sense of belonging settling over him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. In the quiet moments before they each found a place to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, just maybe, the emptiness he had carried for so long had finally begun to fade. A fragile trust. Gabriel Stroud woke early, the soft morning light filtering through the tall trees that encircled his modest home on Andorra. It had been years since he'd awoken to the sound of others stirring nearby, the quiet hum of life that reminded him, against all odds, he wasn't alone anymore. He sat on the edge of his cot, rubbing his tired eyes and gathering his thoughts. The 4 alien women he'd brought here had each found a corner of his small home to settle into, yet the air was thick with unspoken questions and an underlying tension that he knew wouldn't disappear overnight. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of morning, a gentle wind brushing through the leaves, the calls of distant creatures, and the soft rustling of the underbrush. Gabriel opened the door, stepping into the cool air, hoping the serenity of the landscape would help him prepare for the day. He knew that gaining the trust of these women wouldn't be easy. They had survived a life of captivity and betrayal, and his mere promise of freedom was not enough to erase years of pain and caution. As he stood there, he heard footsteps behind him. Ziva, the tall warrior with the bronze skin and defiant eyes, approached, her gaze scanning the forest around them. She had barely spoken since their arrival, observing everything with a wary vigilance, her stance constantly alert. She walked closer, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of curiosity and determination. "This place," she began, her voice low but firm. "It's peaceful. Strange, but peaceful." Gabrielle nodded, looking out over the trees. It's why I chose it. Need a place far from the chaos. A place to start over, or at least to try. Ziva tilted her head, her sharp gaze assessing him. You say you fought many battles, seen bloodshed. And yet here you are, alone, with nothing but this small house and the trees. She paused, as if searching for the right words. Why us? Why bring us here? Gabrielle took a breath, turning to face her. Because you deserve a chance to feel safe. To have a choice. That's something everyone deserves. A flicker of something unreadable passed over Ziva's face, but she quickly masked it. Gabrielle could sense that this was her way, a layer of strength and suspicion she had built up as a shield. He respected it. Trust couldn't be given, it had to be earned. Inside, the others were stirring. Elith, the feline-like woman with her sharp senses and piercing gaze, prowled by the window, watching the forest like a hunter watching prey. Nora, the empath with shimmering silver skin, stood quietly nearby, her head tilted as though listening to something beyond their hearing. Laura, with her plant-like limbs and translucent green skin, was already studying the mechanics of Gabrielle's home, her fingers lightly brushing over various devices with a curiosity that seemed endless. As they gathered in the main room, Gabrielle realized they were each waiting for something, an explanation, a reason to trust him, a purpose to keep them there. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of their expectant stares. I won't pretend to understand everything you've been through, he began, his voice steady. But I know a thing or two about scars. Some you can see, some you can't. He looked each of them in the eye, hoping they could sense his sincerity. This home may not be much, but it's safe. You're free to stay as long as you like, or leave whenever you're ready. All I ask is that, while you're here, you help out where you can. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint sounds of the forest. Finally, Nora stepped forward, her large, liquid eyes filled with a mixture of empathy and sorrow. Thank you, Gabrielle. Few have shown us kindness, and we're not used to it. It's unsettling. Her words held an undercurrent of pain, as though they carried the weight of memories too raw to revisit. Elith, always skeptical, crossed her arms and eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and intrigue. So, what exactly are we supposed to do here? Play house and pretend the world isn't out there waiting to crush us? Gabrielle gave a small smile, understanding her distrust. You don't need to pretend anything. There's plenty that needs doing here. Andora's a fertile planet, and I've got a small plot I've been working on. Not much, but it keeps me busy. You could help me with that if you want, or find your own projects. The land here is rich with resources. At the mention of work, Laura perked up, her eyes glinting with interest. This place, it has potential. I can sense it. The soil, the air, it's also alive. Elith rolled her eyes but didn't protest, though Gabrielle could see a hint of intrigue in her sharp gaze. Ziva, the stoic warrior, simply nodded, her acceptance tacit but resolute. Days passed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to settle into a routine. Gabrielle showed Ziva the small garden he'd started, and though she was initially hesitant, her disciplined nature soon took over. Her warrior instincts adapted quickly to the land, and she learned to tend to the plants with the same precision she'd shown on the battlefield. Nora often lingered close, her gentle presence offering a calming influence on the group. She had a knack for sensing when tensions ran high, diffusing them with a soft word or a comforting glance. Elith, ever watchful, spent her time patrolling the perimeter of their clearing, her sharp senses attuned to the forest's rhythms. Gabrielle respected her instincts, and though she rarely spoke, he could tell she felt some measure of purpose in her self-appointed role. Meanwhile, Lyra's curiosity drove her to explore the intricacies of Gabrielle's makeshift tools and devices. She was fascinated by technology, even if it was outdated by the standards of her own people. Her plant-like nature seemed to blend harmoniously with the environment, her quiet presence as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves. As days turned into weeks, they began to feel like more than strangers sharing a temporary shelter. A sense of camaraderie emerged, fragile but genuine. They shared stories around the fire in the evenings, each revealing glimpses of lives lost, of families and friends scattered across the galaxy. Gabriel, in turn, spoke of his wife, Alana, whose memory lingered in the small, familiar corners of his home. He told them of the battles he fought, the sacrifices made, and the quiet pain of an empty house. One evening, as the firelight flickered over their faces, Zava finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with unspoken weight. "Kayla won't forget what you did, Gabriel. He's not the type to forgive a slight. If he finds us..." Gabriel's expression darkened. "If he comes, I'll be ready." Elith scoffed, her tone laced with bitter humor. An old soldier with a few blasters against Keller's entire fleet. How noble. He shrugged, unbothered. "I faced worse odds." Nara reached out, placing a gentle hand on Elith's shoulder. "He risked his life for us. Maybe it's time we stop running and face what comes together." The idea seemed to settle over them, a silent agreement forming in the flickering shadows. For the first time, they felt more than just survivors. They felt like a team. The following morning, as dawn crept over the horizon, they began to prepare in earnest. Ziva trained rigorously, honing her strength and precision with a ferocity that inspired the others. Elith, though skeptical, began teaching Gabriel defensive tactics, her knowledge of stealth and agility proving invaluable. Lyra, always tinkering, started adapting Gabriel's tools into makeshift weapons, her ingenuity transforming scraps of metal into surprisingly effective defenses. Even Nora, though physically gentle, helped create strategies, her empathy allowing her to anticipate moves and diffuse tensions. Together, they transformed a simple homestead into something more, a fortified sanctuary that echoed with their shared determination. They weren't just preparing for Kayla. They were reclaiming control over their lives, asserting their right to stand tall and defend what they had built together. As the final light of the day faded, Gabriel stood outside, watching the shadows lengthen over the forest. He felt a fierce pride swelling within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his days in the service. They had come together not out of necessity, but choice. And for the first time, he felt that this place, this life, was no longer just a shelter from the galaxy's chaos. It was their home, and they would defend it together. The gathering storm. The first warning of Kayla's retaliation came in the early hours of dawn. The sky, normally a tranquil blue-gray, was disrupted by a dark streak, a ship, far more advanced than Gabriel's humble vessel, slicing through the atmosphere of Andara with an ominous hum. Gabriel watched from the edge of the clearing, his eyes narrowed as he gauged its descent. The ship's shape, sleek and foreboding, was unmistakable. Kayla's forces had finally tracked them down. Inside the homestead, the others stirred, sensing the shift in the air. Elith was the first to reach Gabriel's side, her movements as silent as a shadow. Her sharp, feline eyes scanned the sky, catching the glint of metal as Kayla's ship drew nearer. She said nothing, but the tension in her frame spoke volumes. Ziva, Nara, and Lyra followed soon after, each bracing themselves for what was coming. "They found us," Ziva muttered, her voice edged with steel. She had prepared for this moment, her warrior instincts never letting her forget the looming threat. Kayla doesn't waste time. Gabriel nodded, his gaze still fixed on the approaching ship. "No, he doesn't. But we're not helpless. We've made preparations. We're going to stand our ground." He could feel the weight of their unspoken fears, but he also saw the fierce resolve in their eyes. Over the past few weeks, this patch of land had become more than just a temporary refuge. It was a place where they had begun to reclaim their lives, each of them finding a measure of strength and purpose. They wouldn't surrender it without a fight. As the ship touched down on the outskirts of the forest, its engines thrumming ominously, Gabriel quickly led the others through the plans they had laid out. The small traps Lyra had crafted from spare parts now lined the perimeter, strategically hidden in the underbrush. Ziva and Elif took their places near the entrance, armed with makeshift weapons, their eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. Nora, who had proven herself skilled in reading emotions, positioned herself farther back, ready to monitor the situation and assist as needed. Gabriel himself took a central position, his blaster ready, his heart pounding with the familiar thrill of impending conflict. The air grew heavy as Kayla's ship powered down, and soon figures began to emerge from its belly. Kayla's soldiers were sleek and heavily armored, their movements precise and unhurried. At the forefront was Kayla himself, his figure tall and imposing in elaborate, dark robes that shimmered in the low light. His expression was one of cold amusement, as if he found the very idea of resistance to be little more than a child's game. Well, Kayla drawled, his voice carrying across the clearing. I must admit, I didn't expect the gallant soldier to drag this out. Did you think you could really hide them from me forever, Stroud? Gabriel's grip on his blaster tightened, but he remained calm. They're not yours to find, Kayla. You've taken enough lives. This ends here. Kayla let out a chuckle, his tone laced with mockery. Bold words, old man. But do you really believe these 4 misfits can protect you? I faced entire armies. What chance do you think a ragtag group like yours stands? Beside him, Ziva stepped forward, her posture unyielding. We're no one's property, Kayla. We're not hiding anymore. If you want a fight, you'll get one. Kayla's gaze shifted to her, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Ah, the warrior, he murmured, a dark glint in his eye. Such fire. It's almost a shame to waste it. In a swift motion, he raised his hand, signaling his soldiers forward. They moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons drawn as they advanced on Gabriel and the others. The clearing erupted into chaos as shots were fired, the crackle of blasters splitting the air. Gabriel moved instinctively, firing precise shots as he covered the perimeter, forcing Kayla's soldiers to scatter. Elif darted through the shadows, her movements agile and unpredictable, striking from angles that kept the soldiers off balance. Ziva fought with a fierce determination, her makeshift weapons slicing through the air as she deflected attacks with a skill that spoke to years of battle training. Meanwhile, Lyra used her knowledge of the forest, luring soldiers into the traps she had set, their armor offering little protection against the clever snares and tripwires hidden among the roots. Nora remained at the edge of the fray, her senses attuned to the emotions swirling around her. She could feel the fury and fear radiating from Kayla's soldiers, but she focused her energy on calming her companions, sending waves of reassurance that helped them stay focused. It was a delicate balance, but she managed to steady them, allowing each of them to draw strength from her quiet presence. As the fight raged on, Gabriel found himself face to face with Kayla. The warlord's eyes glinted with malice, his stance arrogant as he regarded the old soldier. Look at you, Kayla sneered. A relic of a forgotten time, clinging to ideals that no longer have a place in this galaxy. Gabriel met his gaze steadily, unyielding. Some things are worth holding on to. Kayla's expression darkened, and he struck out with a vicious swipe of his weapon, a blade that glowed with a searing energy. Gabriel blocked it just in time, his muscles straining under the force of the blow. They exchanged a flurry of attacks, each testing the other's limits. Gabriel could feel his age weighing on him, the years of combat taking their toll, but he refused to back down. Just as Kayla prepared to deliver a decisive blow, a flash of movement caught his eye. Ziva lunged forward, her weapon raised, intercepting Kayla's strike with a fierce cry. Her strength matched Kayla's, and for a moment, the two were locked in a deadly dance, their weapons clashing as they moved with brutal precision. Elif took advantage of the distraction, slipping behind Kayla's guards and taking them down with swift, calculated strikes. She moved like a whisper through the chaos, her presence felt only when it was too late. Lyra continued to defend the perimeter, her traps incapacitating Kayla's men one by one, their shouts of surprise and pain echoing through the clearing. Kayla, realizing he was losing control, let out a snarl of frustration. He pushed Ziva back with a powerful shove, his gaze darting to the few soldiers he had left. Enough of this, he growled. Finish them. But Gabriel's group had gained the upper hand. With Nora's calming influence holding them steady, they fought as a cohesive unit, their trust in each other lending them a strength that surpassed their individual skills. One by one, careless soldiers fell, their once imposing formation crumbling under the relentless assault. Seeing his forces decimated, Kayla took a step back, his expression twisting with rage. He glared at Gabriel, his voice a low, venomous hiss. You may have won this skirmish, Stroud, but mark my words. You've made an enemy of someone far beyond your understanding. This is far from over. With a final glare, Kayla signaled the remnants of his squad to retreat. The few surviving soldiers hurried back to the ship, helping their injured comrades as they withdrew. Kayla cast one last, lingering look at the homestead before boarding his ship, the promise of revenge clear in his eyes. As the ship lifted off and disappeared into the sky, a heavy silence settled over the clearing. Gabriel lowered his blaster, breathing heavily as he surveyed the aftermath. The ground was littered with discarded weapons and the remnants of Kayla's force, but they had held their ground. They had protected their home. The others gathered around him, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but their eyes were alight with a fierce pride. They had fought as a team, each of them contributing in ways they hadn't thought possible. In that moment, they knew they were no longer just strangers bound by circumstance. They were something more, a family forged in the fires of battle. Ziva nodded at Gabriel, a hint of respect in her gaze. We did it. Together. Gabriel smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Yes, we did. But even as they stood victorious, a lingering sense of unease remained. Kayla was a powerful enemy, and he wouldn't forget the humiliation they had dealt him. They would have to remain vigilant, ready for whatever came next. Yet for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, savoring the triumph of their hard-fought victory. They had defended their sanctuary, and in doing so, they had found something even more precious. A place where they belonged, bound together by trust, loyalty, and the shared resolve to protect each other, no matter the cost. New beginnings and old shadows. In the days following Keller's retreat, Gabriel Stroud's homestead returned to its quiet rhythm, but the recent battle left an indelible mark on their small group. They had stood together against an enemy far more powerful than themselves, and in the process, they had become more than just allies, they had become family. Yet, as they settled into their routines, a sense of impending change lingered in the air. Kayla's retreat wasn't a surrender, it was a delay. Each of them knew it, even if they didn't speak of it openly. Gabriel found himself waking earlier than usual, haunted by memories of battles both recent and long past. The stars still shone faintly through the early morning haze, and as he stood at the edge of the clearing, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Alana would have been proud of him, he thought, of how he had chosen to help these women, strangers at first, now dear companions. But pride was tempered by worry. He knew they couldn't stay hidden here forever. Andorra, despite its isolation, was no longer safe. Ziva joined him outside, her silent presence a comfort. The tall warrior's sharp eyes missed nothing as she looked over the forest, her posture relaxed but alert. Over the past weeks, she had become a steadfast protector of the homestead, her bond with Gabriel forged through shared purpose. She glanced at him, sensing his unease. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Gabriel nodded. "Kayla won't forget what we did. He'll come back, and next time, he'll bring more than just a handful of soldiers." Ziva's jaw tightened, and her gaze hardened. "Let him come," she replied, her tone filled with a fierce resolve. "We won't go down easily, not after everything we've fought for." Gabriel admired her spirit, but he knew they couldn't rely on sheer force alone. They needed a plan, a way to stay one step ahead. "We'll need more than courage to face him," he said. "We'll need allies, resources, maybe even a way to communicate with others who oppose Kala's reign." Inside the homestead, the others were already awake, each adjusting to the new reality in their own way. Elif was sharpening her makeshift weapons, her every movement meticulous and controlled. Her natural instincts kept her on edge, even in the stillness of morning. Lyra, ever curious, was modifying a device she had found among Gabriel's old equipment, her fingers moving deftly over the components. And Nora, the empath, stood by the window, her gaze distant, as if listening to the emotions lingering in the air. As Gabriel and Ziva re-entered the homestead, he gathered the group around, his voice filled with a calm authority. "We need to start thinking ahead. Kayla won't give up, and we can't afford to be caught off guard again. I believe it's time we take the fight to him, on our terms." Elif's eyes gleamed with excitement, though her voice was measured. "I'm all for taking the fight to Kayla, but how exactly do we plan to challenge a man with fleets at his disposal?" Lyra, ever the strategist, chimed in. "We need information. Kayla's strength lies in his control over his forces, his connections. If we can find a way to disrupt his network, weaken him from within, we'll have a chance." Nora nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I can help with that. My abilities, they're not just limited to sensing emotions. I can reach into minds if I'm close enough. If we get near Kayla or his top commanders, I might be able to extract something valuable." Gabriel looked at her, a hint of concern in his eyes. "That's a dangerous path, Nora. Mental manipulation isn't something to take lightly. Kayla's men are ruthless." Nora met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I know the risks, but we've all sacrificed something to be here. I'm willing to do my part." They spent the following days preparing for their next move, each of them dedicating their skills to the cause. Ziva trained relentlessly, pushing her physical limits, perfecting her combat skills with an intensity that inspired the others. Elif scouted the perimeter, mapping out possible escape routes and entry points, her mind constantly working to anticipate threats. Lyra's ingenuity shone as she crafted new tools and weapons from the limited resources they had, her knowledge of technology invaluable in strengthening their defenses. Gabriel, too, took an active role, teaching them tactics he'd learned over decades of service. His experience was a guiding light, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, strategy could level the playing field. Each evening, they gathered around the fire, discussing plans and recounting stories that eased the tension and brought them closer together. For the first time, Gabriel felt the burden of loneliness lift, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. One night, as they sat around the fire, Zeva shared a story from her past, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "Where I come from," she began, "we have a saying, 'The roots of the strong bind the earth.' It means that those who stand together, rooted in purpose, are unbreakable." She looked at each of them, her eyes filled with a fierce loyalty. "That's what we have here. We're bound by something greater than survival. We're bound by a promise to protect each other, no matter the cost." Elif, who had always been guarded, seemed to soften at Ziva's words. "I spent most of my life on the run," she admitted. "Trust doesn't come easily for me. But here, with all of you, I finally feel like I can stop running." Gabriel's heart swelled with pride as he listened. These women, each with their own scars, had come together not just as allies, but as family. He knew they were capable of facing whatever lay ahead. And though he couldn't predict the future, he was ready to confront it with them. But as they strengthened their resolve, shadows continued to gather. News of Kayla's defeat had spread, and it wasn't long before whispers reached Andara. A small, discreet ship arrived one evening, carrying a figure cloaked in anonymity. Gabriel approached with caution, his hand resting on his blaster as he addressed the stranger. The figure lowered their hood, revealing a face weathered by time and hardship. It was an old acquaintance of Gabriel's, a former intelligence operative named Jarek. Gabriel's surprise was evident, but he maintained his composure, greeting Jarek with a wary nod. "What brings you to Andara, Jarek?" Gabriel asked, his tone guarded. Jarek's gaze was serious, his voice a low murmur. I heard about your stand against Kayla. Word travels fast, and not everyone's thrilled with his rule. I came to offer help. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. And what would an ex-operative like you want in return? Jarek smirked, the expression tired but genuine. Kayla has enemies everywhere, Stroud. He's ruled through fear for too long, and there are those who would gladly see him fall. If you're willing, we can connect you with those who share your purpose. But know this, the moment you align with them, there's no turning back. Gabriel looked to his companions, each of their faces reflecting the same determination. They were ready. Nodding, he turned back to Jarek. We accept. Tell us what we need to know. Jarek led them through the intricacies of Kayla's network, revealing weaknesses and contact points where they could gain allies. There were resistance cells scattered across various systems, each willing to lend support in exchange for a chance to destabilize Kayla's grip. Together, they plotted a path forward, a mission that would take them far beyond the safe confines of Andara. As the sun rose over the homestead, Gabriel felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just preparing for survival anymore, they were fighting for change, for the freedom to live without fear. With their newfound allies, they had a real chance to take down Kayla, to dismantle the corruption that had plagued their lives. That morning, they set out on their journey, leaving behind the sanctuary they had built, carrying with them the strength of their bond. The forest of Andara disappeared into the distance, but in their hearts, they knew they would return one day, not as fugitives, but as victors. As they traveled through the stars, a shared hope fueled them, a vision of a future free from Kayla's shadow, a galaxy where they could live without chains, bound not by fear, but by loyalty and love. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with risks and unknowns, but they were no longer alone. They were a family, a force bound by trust and forged in battle, and together, they would bring light to even the darkest corners of the galaxy.